This collaborative project was first conceived by Jess Hooper back in 2021, when we were all postgraduate researchers with the University of Exeter. Our original idea was admittedly overly ambitious and has undergone several methodological iterations, and the coding was still a mammoth task. However, the process of collating the articles and deliberating over the coding has been intellectually worthwhile. And the data has so much more to tell us that we already see several more papers ready to emerge from this project. So what we'll share today is a summary of the key findings and analysis of our results. Hopefully there'll be time at the end for discussions about limitations, caveats, and future directions this study might take. And one thing that will become apparent from our selection of journals and articles is the Anglo-American nature of our study, which reflects how English has become the de facto language of academia and global discourses. What this means for the international research community is something we don't believe has been adequately addressed or problematized. Or maybe it has in other languages, and those of us with English privilege, which all five of us have, are simply ignorant of attempts to address language-limited issues in knowledge generation and sharing. If there's not an opportunity to discuss this today, we would love to hear your thoughts on this. For this study, we adopted a broad definition of Anthrozoology as being the academic study of human relations to other animals, and use it interchangeably with the term human-animal studies, or HAS. Our study seeks insight into what direction or directions Anthrozoology scholarship is taking. We address this by examining peer-reviewed papers published in key journals that identify themselves as focusing on human interactions, perceptions, or relations with other animals. We looked at the types of human-animal relations receiving focus to determine what animal groups or species have received the most or least attention. The data consists of 19 journals listed on the x-axis here, with the year the journals were established shown in brackets. The journals that we selected were featured on the Society and Animals Institute website as a representation of the international journals dedicated to human-animal studies. Of the 19 selected journals, 17 publish exclusively in English. Trace also publishes in Finnish or Swedish, and Relations accepts articles in Italian. Owing to our own language limitations, only papers written in the English language were included in our study. This study focused on primary research articles and peer-reviewed essays, and we omitted book reviews, conference reports, article commentaries, and editorial introductions. An additional 22 papers were subsequently removed during the coding, as they were not really about other than human animals. For example, 14 environment-focused articles published in Relations, and several others, including an article on plant sentience, were omitted. In total, 4,020 articles were included in our study. The number of articles from each journal are indicated on the y-axis, and the percentage of the total included in our study are indicated in brackets above each bar. Obviously, the longer running journals will have contributed more papers to the full data set. Most notably, 25% of the data comes from Anthrozoös. And Anthrozoös, Society and Animals, and JAWS combined make up 60% of our data. Combined, the other 16 journals comprise 40% of the data. And this is something we bear in mind when analysing trends over time and begin to explore how the newer journals may be shifting the focus. So content analysis covers a range of methods that seek to provide knowledge and understanding of the phenomenon under study. Although first developed as a quantitative method, content analysis has since been adapted to enable qualitative and contextual analysis. Heisch and Shannon defined the qualitative content analysis as a research method for the subjective interpretation of the content of text data through the systematic classification process of coding and identifying themes or patterns. And similar content analyses have been performed on articles published in single journals, including 2 journals also included in our content analysis, namely JAWS and HAIB. And these articles are referenced at the bottom of this slide. These both informed and complemented our study. A central aim of our study was to determine how other than human animals are studied relative to their relationship with humans, and how and why this may be changing. Thus, the study took a summative content analysis approach, which involves first coding and categorizing, followed by the interpretation of the underlying context. For each journal article, the following information was recorded to an Excel sheet. The title, the journal name, year of publication, the country of the corresponding author's institution affiliation, or independent if the scholar did not list an institutional affiliation, and whether or not it was part of a special issue or thematic collection. Based primarily on the abstract, any specific species or species groups who were named as the focus of the paper were also noted, and then the abstracts were subjected to coding for animal groups explained in the next slide. So shown here is an abridged version of our coding table. And we are aware that some of our shorthand descriptors may be problematic, but ask that you overlook that for now. We went through multiple iterative rounds of coding segments of data, group discussions, and revisions to arrive at the coding table shown here, which were ultimately applied to the entire data set. Each researcher asked themselves what animal group the authors appeared most interested in, or who could be considered the main research beneficiaries. The pet code was applied to articles about companion animals, including the benefits of pet keeping to humans, multi-species families, legal statuses, relinquishment, rehoming, and shelter life. We realize exotic is a loaded term, but the code refers to non-domesticated species living within a household or who are part of the exotic pet trade. This includes wild species being kept as pets or species generally deemed by animal welfare organizations as being unsuitable as companion animals, such as parrots and snakes. The Wildlife Code was applied to papers about animals living in their natural habitat or kept in wildlife sanctuaries for rehabilitation centres. The focus could either be on the individual animals, the conservation of the species, or the benefits derived from nature by humans. Included here are indigenous relations with the animals, human-wildlife conflict, and wildlife-based tourism. The Zoo Code refers to any species on exhibition or used for educational entertainment purposes, including petting zoos, safari parks, aviaries, public aquariums, amusement parks, and circuses. And these can be either from an animal welfare or animal rights perspective, or studies focusing on human benefits or attitudes towards zoos. The Lab Code was applied to papers focused on animals utilised for medical, behavioural, or cosmetic research, as well as educational settings where the animals are the object or subject to the study. For example, analysis of the anti-vivisection movement and relations between technicians and lab animals were coded with the Lab Code, as well as some papers about animal rights and ethics. The Farmed Animal Code is defined as any species modified by humans for their products, and included domesticated farm animal species who were kept as companion animals or in sanctuaries. And articles about veganism are included here too. Sport and leisure was the code assigned to animals used in sporting or hobbyist activities, including large animals kept as companions such as horses and donkeys. And also included here are the victims of blood sports. The liminal group is for animals occupying spaces without human permission, namely those considered feral, such as unowned cats or dogs, or animals having ambiguous statuses as urban animals, such as pigeons or foxes. And those transition in between states, such as the rewilding of captive animals or displacement by human activities, belong here. Also included are those considered monstrous or chimeric creatures, including species being bred for the purposes of de-extinction. Service animals are those used as beasts of burden for transport or employed as service animals, such as in the police force or trained as guide dogs. This code includes those identified as emotional support animals and used in animal-assisted services. And the non-specific code is more about animal attitudes, more about human attitudes towards animals in general, or philosophical viewpoints that are not focused on any one of the predefined groups. And as I said, each article was coded primarily based on the title, abstract, and keywords. So first we looked at how the animal group codes were represented in the pool of 4,020 articles included in our study from 19 journals and published from 1985 through to 2023. And because some articles were assigned more than one code, the total counts do exceed 4,020. Overall, articles coded as PET to predominate, followed by the non-specific code. And the marked increase in journals dedicated to publishing Anthrozoology or as scholarship led us to address how trends related to the animal groups may have changed over time and across the focus journals. So firstly, we examined the trends over time. The PET and non-specific codes are the most prevalent codes during the 1980s and 1990s, and continue to increase exponentially during the past 2 decades. However, interest in exotic companion animals has always remained low. The zoo, lab, and sports and leisure codes remain consistent with the number of articles steadily accumulating over time. From 2012, there are increases in the proportion of total farmed, wildlife, and liminal coded papers being published. And from 2014 and again in 2018, there are exponential increases in the proportion of service articles. The latter coincides with the debut of People and Animals, the People and Animals International Journal, and its focus on human-animal interactions in the context of animal-assisted services. So despite the rise in the mid-1990s, due in part to the founding of journals focused on law and critical animal studies, there is a sustained but not a growing interest in lab animals. Conversely, an exponential rise in wildlife and farmed animals occurred around 2012. And indicated at the bottom of this slide are the years some of the newer journals entered the scene. So given the more focused scope of some of the newer journals included in our study, we predicted that some would represent certain animal groups more than others. Furthermore, because the largest contributions came from the longer-running, more generalized journals, we wanted to examine how trends might differ within newer or specialized journals, as these may provide insight into growing areas of interest. So just looking at articles published 2010 through 2023, the journals that were established post 2009 have a lower percentage of papers coded as PETs compared to Anthrozoös, Society and Animals, and JAWS, the output from these during the same period. Amongst the post-2009 established journals, there is also a marked increase in the proportion of articles coded as non-specific, which appears to result from an increased focus on philosophical and legal debates about animal rights and consciousness, etc., more generally, as well as broad studies of attitudes towards animals and humane education. There is also more of a focus on farm and service animal groups amongst the newer journals, and a marked decrease in the zoo group. So before we start looking at the data from a different angle, I wanted to share some brief insights from looking at papers that were co-coded to 2 or more animal groups. So co-codes that are above 2% are highlighted here in pale yellow, those above 4% in darker yellow, and the one that is above 10% is shown in orange. And so these explain how the subsequent slides, for example, papers about cats, may have got coded as wildlife. It is not because the cats are considered wildlife themselves, but rather that these papers are about both free-living companion animals who are predating on wildlife, and both the prey species and the cats were central to the paper, hence both pet and wildlife. Other times, the same species may be considered within different groups. For example, a wild horse could be coded as wildlife, or one used for transport or employed as a police horse, or used in animal-assisted therapy would be coded as service. And most contemporary relations with horses would be coded as sport and leisure. We also looked at the species being represented. Sometimes this was by naming a specific species such as Canis familius, and other times a group of species such as frogs or insects. And we coded these and then assigned them to one of 6 animal species groups, namely mammal, bird, fish, reptile, invertebrate, or amphibian. Generic was reserved for the papers that did not specify a specific species or type of animal species. So some papers mentioned multiple species, and some of these resulted in the paper being coded to more than one of the 6 species groups. Hence, the total does exceed 4,020. So, as you can see, mammals receive by far the most attention. And we had predicted mammals will be overrepresented, knowing the focus has historically been predominantly on companion animals, namely cats and dogs. And knowing that the most popular charismatic megafauna are mammalian species. However, we were surprised at how underrepresented the other species groups were. Next, we look more closely at the type of mammalian species being named. So 729 papers, that's 32% of the mammals, were specifically about dogs, followed by cats, 10% of mammals, and ranking only slightly above horses. So shown in this table are animal species that were counted over 20 times. Other named species comprise less than 1% of the total mammalian focus papers. As you can see, the popular charismatic megafauna are up there on that list: elephants, wolves, bears. A lot of studies focused on primates and big cats, not shown here as a collective. Cats, pigs, and sheep were mostly in papers coded as farmed. Amphibians were the least represented of the 6 species groups shown in the last slide, and these papers were coded as exotic, pet, wildlife, lab, and zoo. Out of the 9 amphibian papers, there was 6 specific mention of frogs in publications scattered between 1998 and 2023. Cats and dogs. 957 of the papers were either cats and or dog-focused papers. That's 24% of the total 4,020 papers, and these mostly belong to the pet code. However, 25% of the service-coded papers were about dogs, and 18% of the liminal-coded papers were about cats. So referring back to the point I made earlier, a cat-focused paper may be co-coded as wildlife due to it being both about free-living, liminal, or companion cats predating on wildlife. and horses. 218 papers focused on horses. That's 10% of the mammalian papers. Mostly these were coded to sport and leisure, 55%. Service was also high for horses, which was mostly horses being used in animal-assisted services, although a few historical papers were about horses used for transport. Farmed is the biggest animal group code amongst papers about birds, followed by wildlife. And 42 of the named bird papers, that's 33%, are chickens, mostly hens. Fish. 11 of the named fish species, 22%, are sharks, which are one of the few non-mammalian species listed amongst the most popular charismatic megafauna. Most of these are about sharks as wildlife, and wildlife is the biggest animal group amongst the fish-focused papers. And then reptiles, 19 of the named reptile species, that's 33%, are snakes. And many of the exotic pet papers were focused on snakes, but wildlife is the biggest animal group for all reptiles. So invertebrates, 15 of the named invertebrate species, that's 23% of the invertebrate group, are bees, which were coded as wildlife, farmed, liminal, and lab. And overall, wildlife is the biggest animal group for invertebrates, which are primarily insects, although several papers exist that do focus on the octopus. So now we turn to the human animals who wrote these papers. We only recorded the country of the institutional affiliation given by the lead author. So this data does not measure nationality of the authors or take into account contributions by collaborators located in different countries. However, it does show that most of the literature has been produced by lead authors affiliated with US universities, followed by UK, Australian, and Canadian institutions. So the table on the right shows the countries that represent over 1% of total papers analysed. So what conclusions can we draw? So we set out to determine what directions Anthrozoology or HAS scholarship is taking, and concluded that it has always been about companion animals or companion animal species used in animal-assisted therapies. And the field is still very much mammalian-centric. Although newer journals appear to be broadening the focus to relationships beyond those involving companion animals or grounded in the human use benefit. So in this final slide, we've listed some of the most obvious limitations and caveats of this study that we are aware of. And you're invited to point at anything else you feel we may need to consider. So we only focused on 19 journals derived from the Society and Animals Institute website. And this in itself was a mammoth task. So other journals, book chapters, theses, etc. are not part of this study. However, similar coding could be applied to these too. And as we mentioned at the onset, we only focused on literature published in English. However, limited global reach of non-English publications is a feature of the current state of academia and something we would love to discuss further. And of course, we recognize coding methods to some extent shape the results. For example, in how we identify generic pet studies as mammal-focused, unless specifically stated otherwise. And then, of course, the subjective nature of coding is always something to be considered, especially regarding those awkward fits that don't neatly fit into one of our coding categories. However, the methodology was designed to accommodate this. and we feel fairly confident that our coding represents a consensus. So thank you for listening, and we really hope there is time for questions, comments, or suggestions. And you are also welcome to contact us via email.